Part 1. The Hook. Why everyone thinks Plato is boring. When someone mentions Plato, what's the first image that comes to mind? Most people picture dusty classrooms filled with bored students, ancient Greek texts that no one can understand, and professors droning on about abstract concepts that seem completely disconnected from real life. Ask random people on the street about Plato, and you'll get responses like boring philosophy class, the cave guy, or didn't he want to ban all artists? The verdict seems unanimous. Plato equals boring. Case closed. But here's the thing about Plato's reputation. It's one of the greatest misunderstandings in intellectual history. Everything you think you know about this ancient Greek philosopher is not just wrong, it's spectacularly wrong. Plato has become the victim of what could be called the Brussels sprouts effect. Everyone claims to hate Brussels sprouts, but most people have only ever had them boiled into flavorless mush by their elementary school cafeteria. That's exactly what happened to Plato. For generations, Plato's ideas have been served up in the most unappetizing way possible. They've been stripped of context, drained of passion, and presented as abstract word salads that have nothing to do with real life. No wonder people think he's boring. The typical philosophy class presents Plato like a museum piece, something to be observed from a respectful distance, analyzed and filed away. Students encounter charts about theory of forms and hear lectures about perfect abstract ideals that seem to have no connection to their daily struggles with rent, relationships, or finding meaning in life. The problem is fundamental. We've been teaching Plato wrong. We've turned him into exactly the kind of pompous, out-of-touch intellectual that he spent his entire career criticizing. The real Plato wasn't writing for academics locked away in ivory towers. He wasn't trying to create abstract theories for the sake of abstract theories. Plato was trying to save the world. He was trying to figure out how human beings could live better lives, how societies could function more justly, and how we could tell truth from lies, reality from illusion. Walk into any bookstore today, and you'll find Plato filed under ancient philosophy, sitting next to intimidating academic texts that make calculus textbooks look like beach reads. These editions are typically 400 pages of dense text, filled with footnotes in Latin and introductions by professors who seem to have lost touch with normal human communication decades ago. This is how most people encounter Plato, and it's no wonder they run screaming. But what if you discover that Plato's actual writings are nothing like these dry academic presentations? What if you learn they're full of humor, drama, politics, and ideas so radical they'd make your head spin? The secret that many don't realize is that Plato didn't write boring treatises. He wrote dialogues, conversations, debates, character-driven dramas where ideas clash like titans. Think of them as the ancient world's equivalent to compelling television series, where philosophical concepts emerge through dynamic human interactions rather than dry lectures. Imagine sitting down with Plato for coffee. Would he spend 2 hours lecturing you about abstract forms? Absolutely not. He'd probably start by asking you why you believe what you believe. Then he'd systematically challenge every assumption you've ever held about reality, truth, love, and justice, all while making you feel like you were having the most stimulating conversation of your life. This approach came from his teacher, Socrates, whose method wasn't to bore people into submission with lectures, but to wake them up by asking questions that made their brains work in entirely new ways. The tragedy is that somewhere along the way, we forgot this dynamic approach. We transformed Plato into precisely the kind of intellectual that he critiqued throughout his career. We made him boring by abandoning the very questioning method that made his philosophy revolutionary in the first place. This isn't just an accident of bad teaching, though there's plenty of that. The deeper issue is that truly understanding Plato is subversive. It makes you question everything, and not everyone wants people doing that. Plato's questions are genuinely dangerous. They're dangerous to anyone who profits from keeping people ignorant. They're dangerous to anyone who wants citizens to accept simple answers to complex problems. They're dangerous to anyone who believes that the way things currently are is the way things have to be. This explains another reason why Plato gets misrepresented. His ideas threaten established power structures and comfortable assumptions. Every single problem we're dealing with in the modern world, Plato anticipated. The manipulation of public opinion through media, he wrote extensively about it. The dangers of unchecked democracy and mob rule, he predicted exactly how demagogues would exploit democratic systems. the way technology can trap us in bubbles of illusion, preventing us from seeing reality clearly. He literally wrote the foundational text on this phenomenon. His insights into education, relationships, political corruption, and the nature of truth are more relevant today than they were 2,400 years ago. But you'd never know this from standard academic presentations of his work. The typical approach treats Plato as a historical artifact, rather than a living voice speaking directly to contemporary concerns. This academic fossilization has created a massive disconnect between Plato's actual relevance and his popular reputation. People dismiss him as irrelevant precisely when his insights could help them understand everything from social media manipulation to political corruption to personal relationship challenges. The misunderstanding runs so deep that most people's knowledge of Plato comes from oversimplified summaries that miss the point entirely. They hear about platonic relationships without understanding his sophisticated analysis of different types of love. They learn about the philosopher king without grasping his complex critique of political power. They encounter the allegory of the cave as an abstract metaphor rather than an urgent diagnosis of how people become trapped in cycles of ignorance and manipulation. This superficial familiarity actually creates a barrier to genuine engagement. People think they already know what Plato is about, so they never investigate further. They've been inoculated against his ideas by weak doses of academic interpretation that strip away all the power and relevance of his original insights. It's like judging Shakespeare based only on poorly performed high school productions, or dismissing music entirely because you've only heard bad cover bands. The real Plato challenges fundamental assumptions about reality, knowledge, ethics, and politics. He asks uncomfortable questions about whether we really know what we think we know, whether our society is actually just, and whether we're living authentic lives or just going through the motions. These aren't abstract philosophical puzzles. They're urgent practical questions that determine how we vote, whom we trust, how we treat other people, and what we consider valuable in life. Modern people desperately need Plato's analytical tools. We live in an age of information overload where distinguishing truth from propaganda has become increasingly difficult. We face political systems that seem designed to reward the loudest voices rather than the wisest ones. We struggle with relationships in a culture that often confuses physical attraction with genuine love. We grapple with educational institutions that focus more on test scores and on developing critical thinking abilities. All of these challenges were central to Plato's philosophical project. The irony is profound. At precisely the moment in history when Plato's insights are most needed, he's been marginalized as irrelevant. This isn't coincidental, it's systematic. Powerful interests benefit from keeping Plato's ideas locked away in academic departments where they can't influence public discourse. A population that truly understood Plato's analysis of justice, truth, and political manipulation would be much harder to control and exploit. Breaking through this manufactured boredom requires recognizing that Plato isn't offering easy answers or comfortable platitudes. He's providing tools for thinking more clearly about complex problems. His dialogues model intellectual honesty, rigorous questioning, and the courage to follow arguments wherever they lead, even when conclusions challenge cherished beliefs. This is exactly the kind of intellectual courage that our current moment demands. The stakes couldn't be higher. We live in an era where the line between reality and illusion has become increasingly blurred, where political discourse has been reduced to tribal warfare, and where educational systems often prioritize conformity over critical thinking. Plato's philosophy offers a way out of these traps, but only if we're willing to engage with it seriously rather than dismissing it based on secondhand caricatures. Calling Plato boring is like calling Shakespeare irrelevant, Einstein outdated, or Martin Luther King Jr. old-fashioned. It's not just wrong. It reveals a fundamental misunderstanding of what these thinkers were actually trying to accomplish. Plato isn't boring. He's terrifying to shallow thinkers, corrupt politicians, and anyone who has built their worldview on unexamined assumptions. The philosopher everyone loves to dismiss as irrelevant may actually hold the keys to understanding everything that matters in the contemporary world. But recognizing this requires moving beyond sanitized academic versions of his ideas to encounter the radical, challenging, life-changing insights that made him one of history's most influential thinkers. The question isn't whether Plato is boring. It's whether we're brave enough to engage with ideas that might fundamentally change how we see reality, truth, and ourselves. Part 2. Meet the real Plato, the revolutionary rebel. Most people picture Plato as a dusty old man with a long white beard, sitting in some marble temple, pontificating about abstract ideas that have nothing to do with real life. This image couldn't be further from the truth. The real Plato was a young revolutionary who lived through one of the most turbulent periods in human history, witnessed the collapse of the world's first democracy, and dedicated his life to preventing future civilizations from making the same catastrophic mistakes. Plato wasn't born into the quiet life of a scholar. He was born into privilege, power, and political chaos. His real name wasn't even Plato. That was a nickname meaning broad, probably referring to his athletic build or broad forehead. His actual name was Aristocles, and he came from one of Athens' most prominent families. His stepfather was a politician. His mother's family traced their lineage back to ancient Athenian royalty, and his relatives were deeply involved in the political upheavals that would shape his worldview forever. To understand why Plato became the philosopher he did, you need to understand what Athens was like during his youth. Imagine growing up in a city that considered itself the pinnacle of human civilization, the birthplace of democracy, philosophy, and theater. Athens was in New York, London, and Paris of the ancient world rolled into one. It was a place where ordinary citizens could participate in government, where artists and intellectuals gathered to debate the great questions of existence, and where human potential seemed limitless. But Plato watched this golden age crumble. He lived through the devastating Peloponnesian War, which lasted 27 years and left Athens economically ruined and politically fractured. He witnessed the rise of demagogues who manipulated public opinion for personal gain. He saw democracy transform from a noble experiment into mob rule, where the loudest voices drowned out reasoned discourse, and where popularity mattered more than truth or expertise. The event that changed everything for young Plato was the trial and execution of his teacher, Socrates, in 399 BCE. This wasn't just the death of a mentor. It was a moment when Plato realized that even the most just and wise person could be destroyed by an ignorant and manipulated populace. Socrates had spent his life trying to make people think more clearly, question their assumptions, and live more examined lives. For this, he was accused of corrupting the youth and sentenced to death by a democratic jury. Imagine how this must have affected a young man who had believed in the promise of Athenian democracy. The very system that was supposed to protect truth and justice had murdered the most truthful and just person he knew. This wasn't just a personal tragedy. It was a complete breakdown of everything Plato had been raised to believe about politics, society, and human nature. Many people in Plato's position would have become cynical, withdrawn from public life, or simply accepted that the world was fundamentally unjust. But Plato chose a different path. Instead of giving up on the possibility of a better society, he decided to figure out why Athens had failed and how future societies could do better. This decision would make him one of history's most influential thinkers. Plato's response to political crisis wasn't a retreat into abstract theorizing. It was to become an educational revolutionary. In 387 BCE, he founded the Academy, arguably the world's first university. This wasn't just a school. It was a research institution, a think tank, and a training ground for future leaders, all rolled into one. The Academy would operate continuously for over 900 years, making it one of the longest-lasting educational institutions in human history. The Academy's approach to education was radically different from anything that had existed before. Instead of simply transmitting received wisdom from teacher to student, Plato created an environment where students were encouraged to question everything, think critically about complex problems, and develop their own philosophical positions through rigorous debate and inquiry. The motto inscribed over the Academy's entrance read, "Let no one ignorant of geometry enter here." Not because geometry was the most important subject, but because mathematical reasoning represented the kind of clear, logical thinking that Plato believed was essential for understanding any complex topic. Students at the Academy didn't just study philosophy in the narrow sense. They engaged with mathematics, astronomy, biology, politics, ethics, and what we would now call psychology and sociology. Plato understood that the problems facing human societies were interconnected and required interdisciplinary approaches. You couldn't understand justice without understanding human nature, and you couldn't understand human nature without studying both individual psychology and social dynamics. The academy attracted brilliant minds from across the Mediterranean world. Aristotle, who would become one of history's most influential philosophers and the tutor of Alexander the Great, studied there for 20 years. Women were admitted as students, a revolutionary practice in ancient Greece. The academy became a center of scientific research that made significant contributions to mathematics, astronomy, and natural philosophy. Plato had created not just a school, but an intellectual community dedicated to understanding and improving the human condition. But Plato wasn't content to remain in his academy, safely removed from the messy realities of political life. He believed that philosophers had a responsibility to engage with real-world problems, and he put this belief into practice in ways that were both admirable and occasionally disastrous. He made 3 trips to Sicily, attempting to put his political theories into practice by advising the rulers of Syracuse. These expeditions were largely unsuccessful and sometimes dangerous. On one trip, Plato was reportedly sold into slavery and had to be ransomed by friends. On another, he became entangled in palace intrigue that nearly cost him his life. These experiences taught him that the gap between philosophical theory and political practice was larger and more treacherous than he had initially imagined. But they also reinforced his conviction that philosophers couldn't simply ignore the political realm. Plato's political engagement wasn't limited to foreign adventures. His dialogues repeatedly returned to questions about how society should be organized, what qualities leaders should possess, and how citizens should be educated. Unlike many philosophers who were content to describe the world, Plato wanted to change it. He believed that the problems he had witnessed in Athens, political corruption, the manipulation of public opinion, the triumph of might over right, were not inevitable features of human society, but could be addressed through better institutions and better education. This practical orientation helps explain why Plato's philosophy is so different from the abstract, purely theoretical systems that many people associate with ancient philosophy. Plato was always asking concrete questions. How can we distinguish between knowledge and mere opinion? What makes a person's life worth living? How can we create societies where justice prevails over mere power? These weren't academic exercises. They were urgent questions arising from his lived experience of political crisis and social breakdown. Plato's approach to these questions was also revolutionary. Instead of offering dogmatic answers, he developed a method of inquiry that he learned from Socrates but refined and expanded. The Platonic dialogue doesn't just present philosophical conclusions. It models the process of philosophical thinking. Readers don't just learn what Plato thought about justice or knowledge or love. They participate in the intellectual journey that led to those conclusions. This methodological innovation had profound implications for how we think about education, politics, and human relationships. Plato showed that real understanding comes not from passive reception of information, but from active engagement with ideas. He demonstrated that the most important truths can't simply be transmitted from one person to another, but must be discovered through personal intellectual effort. This insight would revolutionize pedagogy and remains at the heart of liberal arts education today. The dialogues themselves reveal a thinker who was simultaneously systematic and playful, rigorous and imaginative. Plato could construct complex philosophical arguments about the nature of reality, but he could also tell stories, create memorable characters, and use humor to make serious points. His writing style was deliberately accessible. He wanted to reach educated general audiences, not just professional philosophers. The dialogues were performed as dramatic works, making philosophical ideas available to people who might never have engaged with purely theoretical texts. Plato's intellectual courage is evident throughout his work. He was willing to follow arguments wherever they led, even when the conclusions challenged conventional wisdom or his own previous beliefs. He criticized democracy at a time when Athens was trying to rebuild its democratic institutions. He argued for the equality of women in some contexts when this was almost unthinkable in ancient Greek society. He suggested that conventional moral and political categories might be fundamentally mistaken, requiring complete reconceptualization of how societies should be organized. This willingness to challenge orthodoxy made Plato dangerous to established authorities, but also made him incredibly influential among subsequent thinkers. Nearly every major philosopher in the Western tradition has had to grapple with Platonic questions and methods, even when disagreeing with the specific conclusions. Augustine, Aquinas, Descartes, Kant, Hegel, and countless others built their systems in dialogue with Plato's ideas. The real Plato was neither the boring academic of popular imagination, nor the detached theorist of scholarly caricature. He was a passionate reformer who believed that philosophy could change the world, an innovative educator who created new institutions for human learning, and a brilliant writer who made complex ideas accessible to general audiences. He lived through crisis and trauma, made mistakes, took risks, and dedicated his life to the conviction that human beings could live better, more just, and more fulfilling lives if they were willing to think more clearly about fundamental questions. Understanding this historical context helps explain why Plato's ideas remain so relevant today. He wasn't addressing abstract, timeless questions removed from practical concerns. He was grappling with the same kinds of political crises, educational challenges, and social problems that we face in the modern world. His solutions may not always be applicable to contemporary circumstances, but his methods for analyzing these problems and his commitment to rigorous thinking about human affairs provide tools that are more valuable today than ever. The tragedy is that we've lost sight of this revolutionary Plato and replaced it with a safe, sanitized version that poses no challenge to contemporary complacency. The real Plato was subversive, unsettling, and transformative. He demanded that people examine their lives, question their assumptions, and take responsibility for creating more just societies. This is precisely the kind of thinking that our own crisis-ridden world desperately needs. Plato, the revolutionary rebel, understood that ideas have consequences, and that philosophical thinking is not a luxury for those with too much time on their hands, but an essential tool for anyone who wants to live a meaningful life in a complex world. He showed that education is not just about acquiring information, but about developing capacity for independent thought and ethical judgment. He demonstrated that political problems cannot be solved through mere technical expertise, but require wisdom, which comes only through sustained engagement with the deepest questions about human nature and social organization. This is the Plato we need to rediscover. Not the plaster saint of academic philosophy, but the young revolutionary who looked at a broken world and decided to fix it to the power of human reason guided by ethical commitment. His legacy is not a set of doctrines to be memorized, but an approach to thinking and living that remains as radical today as it was 2,400 years ago. Part 3. The Cave Allegory, Ancient Netflix, and Social Media Critique. Picture this scenario. You've been chained to a chair your entire life, facing a wall in a dark cave. Behind you, people carry objects past a fire, casting shadows on the wall in front of you. These shadows are the only reality you've ever known. You think they're the actual objects, the real world. Then someone breaks your chains, drags you toward the fire, and forces you to see that what you thought was reality was just shadows. Finally, they drag you outside into sunlight, where you discover an entire world you never knew existed. This is Plato's famous allegory of the cave from the Republic. And if you think it sounds like the plot of The Matrix, you're absolutely right. The Wachowski sisters explicitly drew on Plato when creating their cyberpunk masterpiece. But here's what most people miss. Plato wasn't creating a quaint ancient parable about abstract philosophical concepts. He was writing a devastating critique of his contemporary media landscape that applies with terrifying accuracy to our own digital age. When Plato wrote about prisoners chained in a cave, watching shadows on a wall and mistaking them for reality, he was thinking about the citizens of Athens who got their information from poets, politicians, and public speakers, the mass media of his time. These information sources, Plato argued, presented distorted images of reality that prevented people from thinking clearly about important issues. The shadows on the cave wall represented the second-hand, manipulated information that most people accepted as truth without ever examining the sources or seeking direct knowledge. Now, fast forward 2,400 years to our current media environment. We spend hours each day staring at screens, consuming content created by others, believing that this mediated experience represents reality. Social media feeds show us carefully curated images of other people's lives. Algorithmic recommendation systems create echo chambers that reinforce our existing beliefs, and news organizations present information filtered through editorial perspectives and commercial considerations. We are, quite literally, watching shadows on a wall and mistaking them for the real world. The parallels become even more striking when you consider how modern technology creates the kind of passive, chain experience that Plato described. Social media platforms are designed to be addictive, to keep users scrolling and consuming content rather than engaging actively with the world around them. The infinite scroll of Instagram, the autoplay feature on YouTube, the notification systems that interrupt our thoughts. These technologies literally chain our attention to screens, making us passive consumers of images and information. Consider how Netflix's recommendation algorithm works. The system analyzes your viewing history, compares it to millions of other users, and suggests content designed to keep you watching. You're not choosing what to watch based on your own independent judgment. You're being guided by an algorithmic system that profits from your continued attention. The algorithm doesn't care whether the content is true, meaningful, or beneficial to your life. It only cares whether it will hold your attention. This is exactly the kind of manipulation that Plato warned about when he described people becoming so attached to shadows that they would resist efforts to show them reality. The cave allegory becomes even more relevant when we examine how social media creates false realities. Instagram and TikTok are filled with carefully staged content designed to present idealized versions of people's lives. Users see endless streams of perfect bodies, exotic vacations, successful careers, and happy relationships. But these images are shadows, not reality. They're highly edited, selectively chosen representations that bear little resemblance to the complex, messy reality of actual human existence. Young people, especially, are growing up in this cave of curated images, comparing their real lives to other people's highlight reels, and developing distorted ideas about what normal life looks like. The result is epidemic levels of anxiety, depression, and social comparison that will be instantly recognizable to Plato as the psychological damage caused by mistaking shadows for reality. The prisoners in Plato's cave weren't just intellectually confused. They were emotionally and spiritually impoverished by their disconnection from authentic experience. The news media provides another perfect example of Plato's shadow world in action. Most people get their information about current events not from direct experience or careful investigation, but from news sources at present highly simplified, often sensationalized versions of complex situations. Cable news channels create their own reality bubbles, presenting information that confirms their viewers' existing beliefs while filtering out contradictory evidence. Fox News viewers and MSNBC viewers might as well be living in different universes, each group convinced that their shadows on the wall represent objective truth. Social media amplifies this problem exponentially. Facebook's algorithm doesn't show you posts randomly. It shows you content designed to generate engagement, which usually means content that provokes strong emotional reactions. Posts that make you angry, afraid, or outraged are more likely to appear in your feed than posts that present nuanced, balanced perspectives on complex issues. The result is that social media users are constantly exposed to the most extreme, divisive content available, creating a distorted impression of how polarized and hostile the real world actually is. Twitter, in particular, has become a kind of cave where the shadows are tweets, brief, decontextualized statements that often bear little resemblance to the complex thoughts and motivations of the people who write them. Public figures are reduced to their most controversial statements. Complex policy issues are reduced to hashtags and slogans, and human relationships are reduced to follower counts and engagement metrics. People spend hours each day absorbed in this artificial world of condensed, manipulated information, gradually losing touch with the slower, more complex rhythms of actual human interaction. The advertising industry represents perhaps the purest example of what Plato was warning about. Advertisements are literally designed to create false desires and distorted perceptions of reality. They present images of happiness, success, and fulfillment that can supposedly be achieved through consumption of products or services. These images are not reflections of reality. They're carefully constructed illusions designed to manipulate behavior. People spend their lives chasing the promises made by advertisements, pursuing shadow versions of happiness that can never actually be attained through material consumption. Dating apps provide a particularly striking modern parallel to Plato's cave. Users swipe through carefully curated profiles, making split-second judgments based on a few photos and brief text descriptions. These profiles are shadows, highly selective representations that reveal almost nothing about the complex reality of the people they supposedly represent. The apps reduce human beings to a set of visual and demographic markers, encouraging users to treat potential partners as commodities to be evaluated and discarded rather than complex individuals to be understood and appreciated. The psychological effects of this digital cave are profound and measurable. Studies consistently show that heavy social media use correlates with increased rates of depression, anxiety, and social isolation. People who spend more time consuming digital content report feeling less satisfied with their own lives and less connected to their communities. This isn't coincidental. It's exactly what Plato predicted would happen when people become too attached to shadows and lose contact with direct, unmediated experience. But Plato's allegory doesn't stop with describing the problem. It also describes the difficult process of liberation. In the allegory, when the prisoner is first freed from his chains, he doesn't experience joy or relief. Instead, he's confused, disoriented, and angry. The bright light hurts his eyes after a lifetime of darkness. He wants to return to the familiar shadows rather than deal with the challenging complexity of reality. This resistance to enlightenment is a crucial part of Plato's analysis. We can see this dynamic playing out in contemporary culture whenever people are confronted with information that contradicts their established beliefs. Rather than welcoming new perspectives, people often react with hostility and retreat further into their existing echo chambers. Someone who gets their news exclusively from conservative sources will often dismiss liberal perspectives as fake news without seriously engaging with the content. Similarly, someone embedded in liberal information bubbles will often dismiss conservative viewpoints as ignorant or malicious without attempting to understand the underlying concerns. The phenomenon of unfriending people on social media who express different political views is a perfect example of voluntary return to the cave. When faced with the discomfort of encountering perspectives that challenge their assumptions, people choose to eliminate those perspectives from their information environment rather than grapple with the complexity they represent. This creates increasingly homogeneous echo chambers where people's existing beliefs are constantly reinforced and never seriously challenged. Plato understood that genuine education requires more than simply presenting people with correct information. It requires a fundamental transformation of how people relate to information itself. The freed prisoner in the cave allegory doesn't just learn new facts. He develops entirely new capacities for perception and judgment. Similarly, escaping from our contemporary digital caves requires more than just consuming different media sources. It requires developing what Plato called philosophical wisdom, the ability to distinguish between appearance and reality, between knowledge and mere opinion, between authentic experience and manufactured illusion. This process is necessarily difficult and often uncomfortable. Real thinking requires effort, uncertainty, and the willingness to abandon cherished beliefs when evidence contradicts them. It's much easier to remain in the cave, passively consuming predigested information that confirms what we already believe. This is why Plato emphasized that philosophical education can't be forced on people. They have to choose to undertake the difficult journey toward truth and reality. The freed prisoner in Plato's allegory has a moral obligation to return to the cave and help others escape, even though they will initially resist and may even react with hostility. This represents a philosopher's duty to engage in public education and political reform, despite the personal costs involved. In our contemporary context, this means that people who recognize the limitations and dangers of our digital information environment have a responsibility to help others develop more critical and independent relationships with media and technology. But Plato also recognized that this missionary work is dangerous. In the allegory, the other prisoners are likely to kill anyone who tries to free them and show them reality. Throughout history, societies have often responded to genuinely transformative ideas and genuinely independent thinkers with suspicion, hostility, and sometimes violence. Socrates himself was executed by the Athenian democracy for asking too many uncomfortable questions and challenging too many cherished assumptions. This dynamic continues today. Whistleblowers who expose government or corporate wrongdoing often face severe legal and personal consequences. Journalists who investigate powerful interests frequently find themselves threatened or discredited. Academics who challenge prevailing orthodoxies in their fields may find their careers destroyed. The cave allegory explains why these patterns persist. Most people prefer comfortable illusions to uncomfortable truths, and they will often attack those who threaten to disturb their illusions. The cave allegory also helps explain why genuine media literacy is so much more than simply learning to fact-check information or identify obviously false news stories. Real media literacy requires understanding how all information is constructed, how all media representations involve selection and interpretation, and how our own psychological and social conditioning affects what we pay attention to and how we interpret what we see. Someone who truly understands Plato's insights about the cave will approach all information sources with healthy skepticism, recognizing that even the most seemingly objective news reports involve countless editorial decisions about what to include, what to emphasize, and how to frame complex issues. They will seek out diverse perspectives not because all viewpoints are equally valid, but because understanding reality requires triangulating between multiple imperfect sources of information. Most importantly, they will recognize the irreplaceable value of direct, unmediated experience. No amount of reading about nature can substitute for spending time outdoors. No number of documentaries about other cultures can replace actually traveling and meeting people from different backgrounds. No collection of relationship advice articles can substitute for the messy, unpredictable work of building actual intimate relationships with real human beings. Plato's cave allegory remains one of the most powerful analyses of how mass media and information technology can both enlighten and deceive. Written 2,400 years before the invention of television, the internet, or social media, it nevertheless provides crucial insights for navigating our contemporary information landscape. Plato understood that the fundamental challenge facing human beings is not access to information. It's developing the wisdom to distinguish between authentic knowledge and mere shadows on the wall. The prisoners in Plato's cave were not stupid or lazy. They were victims of a system designed to keep them passive and confused. Similarly, the users of contemporary digital technologies are not inherently gullible or weak-minded. They are responding predictably to systems that have been deliberately designed to capture and monetize their attention. Recognizing the systemic dimension of the problem is the first step toward developing more conscious and intentional relationships with information and media. The ultimate message of the cave allegory is not despair about human gullibility, but hope about human potential. People can be liberated from illusion and manipulation, but only through education that develops their capacity for independent thought and direct experience. This kind of education is more urgent today than ever before, as we navigate an information environment that would have been unimaginable to previous generations, but whose essential dynamics were perfectly understood by one of history's greatest philosophers. Part 4, Love and Relationships, Plato's surprising take. When most people hear the term platonic relationship, they think of boring, sexless friendships between people who've given up on romance and settle for something safe and uncomplicated. This common understanding reveals one of the greatest misinterpretations in intellectual history. The real Plato wasn't advocating for passionless relationships. He was developing the most sophisticated analysis of love and human connection ever written, one that anticipated virtually every insight of modern psychology about relationships, attraction, and human bonding. Plato didn't write one book about love. He wrote extensively about it throughout his career, most famously in the Symposium and Phaedrus. These dialogues present love not as a single emotion or experience, but as a complex spectrum of human connections that range from physical attraction to spiritual transcendence. Far from being antiseptic or prudish, Plato's analysis begins with frank acknowledgement of sexual desire and proceeds to explore how erotic energy can be channeled toward increasingly profound forms of human connection and personal development. The Symposium, in particular, reads like the transcript of an ancient dinner party where each guest offers a different theory about the nature of love. The dialogue includes everything from crude jokes about sexual positions to mystical descriptions of spiritual union. One speaker argues that love is essentially about finding your missing half, an idea that has shaped Western romantic mythology for over 2 millennia. Another suggests that love is fundamentally about procreation and the desire for immortality through offspring. A third proposes that true love involves the mutual pursuit of wisdom and virtue. What makes Plato's treatment so remarkable is his recognition that all these perspectives capture something true about human experience. Love is simultaneously physical and spiritual, selfish and altruistic, temporary and eternal, rather than trying to reduce this complexity to a simple formula. Plato embraces the contradictions and explores how different types of love relate to each other and contribute to human flourishing. The famous speech by Aristophanes in the Symposium presents the myth of soulmates that continues to influence how people think about romantic relationships today. According to this story, human beings were originally spherical creatures with 4 arms, 4 legs, and 2 faces. They became so powerful that they threatened the gods, who split them in half as punishment. Ever since, each person has been searching for their other half, their soulmate, to restore their original completeness. This myth resonates so deeply with contemporary culture because it captures something essential about the experience of falling in love. When people find someone who truly understands them, who shares their values and complements their personality, it does feel like discovering a missing part of themselves. Modern dating culture is built around this platonic insight, the idea that somewhere out there is the one person who will complete us and make us whole. But Plato was too sophisticated a thinker to stop with romantic mythology. The dialogue continues with increasingly complex analyses of what love actually involves and what it can accomplish in human life. The speech by Diotima, a mysterious wise woman who taught Socrates about love, presents the most profound exploration of how romantic attraction can become a vehicle for personal and spiritual development. According to Diotima's account, love begins with attraction to physical beauty in one particular person. But if properly understood and cultivated, this initial attraction can evolve into appreciation for beauty in all people, then a love of beautiful souls regardless of physical appearance, then a love of beautiful institutions and laws, then a love of beautiful knowledge and wisdom, and finally the love of beauty itself, the ultimate source of all beautiful things in the world. This progression from physical attraction to spiritual enlightenment might sound abstract or unrealistic, but actually describes a psychological process that many people experience in long-term relationships. Partners who initially connect through physical attraction often develop deeper appreciation for each other's character, values, and intelligence. They may become interested in creating beautiful things together: homes, families, artistic projects, social institutions. Their love for each other can inspire them to become better people and to contribute more meaningfully to their communities. Modern relationship psychology has rediscovered many of Plato's insights about the different dimensions of love. Psychologist Robert Sternberg's influential triangular theory of love identifies 3 components of romantic relationships: intimacy, emotional closeness and bonding; passion, physical attraction and sexual desire; and commitment, the decision to maintain the relationship over time. Different combinations of these elements produce different types of love: infatuation, passion alone; companionate love, intimacy plus commitment; and consummate love, all 3 components together. Plato anticipated this analysis by more than 2,000 years. His dialogues explore how physical attraction, passion, can develop into deep emotional connection, intimacy, and lasting partnership commitment. But he goes further than contemporary psychology by suggesting that love, when properly understood, can become a vehicle for personal transformation and spiritual development. This transformative dimension of love is largely absent from contemporary dating culture, which tend to focus on compatibility, attraction, and relationship satisfaction rather than on how romantic partnerships can help people become their best selves. Dating apps reduce potential partners to a collection of photos and demographic information, encouraging users to make snap judgments based on superficial criteria. The swipe left, swipe right mentality treats relationships as consumer choices rather than opportunities for mutual growth and development. Plato would have been horrified by this commodification of human connection. In his view, love is not about finding someone who meets your predetermined criteria for an ideal partner. It's about discovering someone whose presence in your life challenges you to grow, inspires you to excellence, and helps you become more than you could be alone. This doesn't mean settling for someone who doesn't attract you or who doesn't share your values. It means recognizing that the most important qualities in a long-term partner are often invisible in initial encounters and emerge only through sustained interaction over time. The concept of platonic love, as it's commonly understood today, represents a profound misreading of Plato's actual position. When Plato wrote about love that transcends physical attraction, he wasn't advocating for sexless relationships. He was describing how sexual energy can be channeled into creative and spiritual activities that enrich both partners and contribute to the broader community. The relationship between mentors and students, between collaborators working on meaningful projects, between friends who inspire each other to moral and intellectual excellence. These connections can be deeply passionate and transformative even when they don't involve sexual intimacy. Contemporary culture has largely lost a vocabulary for describing these kinds of intense, non-sexual relationships. We tend to assume that any deep emotional connection between two people must be either romantic or platonic in the popular sense of casual friendship. But Plato recognized a wide spectrum of meaningful relationships that don't fit neatly into these categories. Connections based on shared intellectual interests, creative collaborations, spiritual seeking, or commitment to social justice. The loss of this vocabulary has impoverished our understanding of human relationships and contributed to the social isolation that characterizes much of modern life. When the only meaningful adult relationships we can imagine are romantic partnerships or casual friendships, we miss opportunities for the kinds of deep, transformative connections that Plato described as essential for human flourishing. Plato's analysis also anticipated many of the problems that plague contemporary relationships. He understood that physical attraction, while important, is not a reliable foundation for lasting partnership. Beauty fades, sexual passion fluctuates, and relationships based primarily on physical compatibility often deteriorate when partners are confronted with the challenges of building a life together. More fundamentally, Plato recognized that many people approach relationships with unrealistic expectations that virtually guarantee disappointment. The myth of soulmates, while psychologically appealing, can lead people to expect their partners to fulfill all their emotional, intellectual, and spiritual needs. When partners inevitably fail to live up to these impossible expectations, relationships often end in bitter disillusionment. Plato's solution wasn't to abandon the ideal of deep romantic connection, but to embed romantic relationships within a broader framework of personal development and social contribution. Partners who are actively working to become better people and to contribute meaningfully to their communities are more likely to maintain their attraction to each other over time. They have shared purposes that transcend their individual needs and desires, providing stability and meaning that can weather the inevitable challenges of long-term partnership. This perspective has profound implications for how people might approach dating and relationship formation. Instead of focusing primarily on finding someone who makes them happy, people might ask what kind of person they need to become in order to be worthy of the kind of love they seek. Instead of looking for someone who meets their needs, they might consider what they have to offer a partner and how they can contribute to a relationship that helps both people grow. Plato also understood that love involves a fundamental tension between possession and freedom. People who are genuinely in love want to be close to their beloved, to know them completely, to share their experiences and emotions. But they also recognize that love requires respecting the other person's autonomy and supporting their independent growth and development. Possessive love, which seeks to control or limit the beloved, ultimately destroys the very qualities that made the person lovable in the first place. This insight is particularly relevant in an age of social media surveillance, where partners can monitor each other's online activities with unprecedented precision. The temptation to check a partner's messages, track their location, or scrutinize their social media interactions reflects the possessive dimension of love that Plato identified as destructive. Healthy relationships require trust, which means accepting uncertainty about your partner's inner life and daily experiences. Plato's writings on love also explore the relationship between romantic partnerships and broader social and political commitments. He recognized that people who are absorbed entirely in their private relationships often become indifferent to the welfare of their communities. But he also understood that people who lack meaningful personal connections often become bitter, cynical, or fanatical in their public commitments. The ideal, in Plato's view, is romantic partnerships that enhance rather than compete with social and political engagement. Partners who inspire each other to excellence and who share commitments to justice and truth can become powerful forces for positive social change. Their private love becomes a model for the kinds of caring relationships that should characterize healthy communities. This vision of love as simultaneously personal and political offers a powerful alternative to contemporary culture's tendency to treat romantic relationships as private consumer choices that have no broader social significance. Plato understood that how people treat their most intimate partners reflects and shapes how they treat other people and how they participate in public life. The ultimate message of Plato's writings on love is that romantic relationships, when properly understood and cultivated, can become vehicles for the highest forms of human development and social contribution. Love is not just about personal happiness or individual fulfillment. It's about creating partnerships that make both people more than they could be alone and that contribute to the flourishing of the broader human community. This understanding of love as transformative and socially significant provides a powerful critique of contemporary dating culture's emphasis on individual satisfaction and consumer choice. It suggests that the most meaningful relationships emerge not from careful calculation of compatibility, but from the courage to open ourselves to connection with people who challenge us to grow and inspire us to excellence. Plato's insights about love remain startlingly relevant because they address the fundamental human need for connection, meaning, and growth that transcends historical and cultural boundaries. His analysis of the progression from physical attraction to spiritual communion describes a psychological process that continues to shape how people experience and understand romantic relationships today. His recognition of love's transformative power offers hope for creating relationships that enhance rather than diminish human potential. Part 5, Politics and Power, the original critique of democracy. If Plato were alive today and turned on the news, he wouldn't be surprised by anything he saw. The rise of populist demagogues who appeal to emotion rather than reason, the spread of misinformation through social media, the polarization of political discourse into tribal warfare, the elevation of celebrity and wealth over expertise and wisdom. Plato predicted all of this with disturbing accuracy over 2,400 years ago. His critique of democracy wasn't the product of elitist snobbery or anti-democratic sentiment. It was a diagnosis of someone who had lived through democracy's failure and understood exactly why it happened. To understand Plato's political philosophy, you need to understand what he witnessed during his lifetime in Athens. He grew up during the golden age of Athenian democracy, when the city-state was at the height of its power and influence. Athens had created the world's first democratic system, where ordinary citizens could participate directly in government, debate policy in public assemblies, and hold leaders accountable through regular elections. It was an unprecedented experiment in popular self-governance that seemed to prove human beings were capable of collective wisdom and justice. But Plato also lived through democracy's spectacular collapse. He witnessed the disasters of the Peloponnesian War, when democratic assemblies made catastrophically bad decisions based on emotional appeals and wishful thinking rather than careful analysis of strategic realities. He saw demagogues rise to power by telling people what they wanted to hear rather than what they needed to know. He watched as the same democratic system that had produced Athens' greatest achievements condemned Socrates to death for asking uncomfortable questions about justice and truth. The Republic, Plato's most famous political work, is often misunderstood as a blueprint for an ideal society or utopian fantasy about philosopher kings. But the dialogue actually begins with a simple question about justice. What makes a person or a society just rather than unjust? Plato constructs his imaginary republic not because he thinks it could or should be implemented, but because he needs a theoretical model to explore what justice means and why it matters. The analysis that emerges from this thought experiment is devastating in its implications for democratic politics. Plato argues that most people are fundamentally ignorant about the most important questions facing any society. What is justice? What makes life worth living? How should power be distributed? What kinds of laws and institutions promote human flourishing? These aren't technical questions that can be answered through opinion polls or majority vote. They require wisdom that comes only through sustained study, careful reasoning, and moral development. Democracy, in Plato's analysis, assumes that all opinions are equally valid and that complex policy questions can be resolved through majority rule. But this assumption is demonstrably false. Not all opinions about medicine are equally valid. We expect doctors to know more about health than random citizens. Not all opinions about engineering are equally valid. We expect bridge designers to understand structural mechanics better than casual observers. Why should we assume that all opinions about justice, education, economics, or foreign policy are equally valuable? The problem becomes even more acute when you consider how democratic systems actually operate in practice. Political success in a democracy depends not on expertise or wisdom, but on the ability to persuade large numbers of people to support you. This means that the most successful politicians are often those who are best at manipulation, emotional appeal, and telling people what they want to hear rather than what they need to know. Plato illustrated this dynamic through his famous ship of state analogy. Imagine a ship where the crew decides to navigate by majority vote rather than by consulting the captain who actually knows how to sail. The crew members compete for control by making increasingly extravagant promises about the voyage: shorter travel times, better food, more entertainment, fewer storms. The person who wins this popularity contest may have no idea how to actually navigate the ship, but they're very good at telling the crew what they want to hear. Meanwhile, the actual expert navigator is ignored or ridiculed as an elitist who doesn't understand what ordinary sailors really want. This analogy captures precisely what Plato observed in Athenian politics and what we can observe in contemporary democratic systems. Politicians compete for votes by making promises they can't keep, appealing to voters' immediate desires rather than their long-term interests, and avoiding complex truths that might be politically inconvenient. The result is government by the least qualified rather than the most qualified, policy-making based on popular prejudices rather than careful analysis, and systematic neglect of difficult but important issues. The rise of Donald Trump provides a perfect case study in Plato's analysis of democratic pathology. Trump's political success had nothing to do with policy expertise, government experience, or demonstrated wisdom about complex issues. Instead, it was based on his ability to appeal to voters' emotions, to simplify complex problems into memorable slogans, and to position himself as the voice of ordinary people against elite establishments. Trump's campaign promises were often impossible or contradictory. He would simultaneously cut taxes and increase government spending, eliminate the national debt and expand military expenditures, bring back manufacturing jobs while reducing regulations on businesses that were outsourcing those jobs. But the logical inconsistencies didn't matter because his appeal was emotional rather than rational. He offered voters someone to blame for their problems and simple solutions to complex challenges. Plato would have recognized Trump immediately as the kind of demagogue who thrives in democratic systems. Such figures succeed not because they understand how to solve problems, but because they understand how to manipulate public opinion. They exploit people's fears, resentments, and desires for easy answers, promising to restore a mythical golden age through force of personality rather than competent governance. But Plato's critique wasn't limited to obviously unqualified demagogues like Trump. He understood that even well-intentioned democratic leaders often make poor decisions because they're constrained by the need to maintain popular support rather than pursue unpopular but necessary policies. Democratic politicians are incentivized to focus on short-term problems that voters can easily understand while neglecting long-term challenges that require sustained effort and sacrifice. Climate change provides a perfect example of this dynamic. The scientific evidence for human-caused global warming has been clear for decades, and the necessary responses, carbon taxes, massive infrastructure investments, lifestyle changes that reduce consumption, have been equally clear. But these policies are politically difficult because they impose immediate costs for long-term benefits, and they require voters to make sacrifices for the welfare of future generations who can't vote in current elections. Democratic politicians who propose serious climate policies often find themselves voted out of office by voters who prefer candidates promising economic growth and lower energy prices. The result is systematic inaction on the most important long-term challenge facing human civilization, precisely because democratic systems are structurally biased towards short-term thinking and immediate gratification. Plato's alternative to democracy was not dictatorship or oligarchy, both of which he analyzed and rejected as even worse than democratic systems. Instead, he proposed that political power should be exercised by philosopher kings, individuals who combine practical wisdom with moral virtue and who are motivated by genuine concern for justice rather than personal gain or popular approval. This proposal is often dismissed as naive or elitist, but Plato's actual description of philosopher kings makes clear that he's not talking about academic intellectuals or ivory tower theorists. His ideal rulers would need to demonstrate practical competence in managing complex organizations, moral integrity in their personal lives, and intellectual honesty in their approach to difficult problems. They would need to be willing to make unpopular decisions when necessary, and to resist the temptations of power, wealth, and fame that corrupt most political leaders. Most importantly, Plato's philosopher kings would need to understand the limits of their own knowledge and to surround themselves with genuine experts in various fields. Rather than pretending to know everything themselves, They would create systems for consulting the most knowledgeable people available and for testing policies carefully before implementing them on a large scale. This vision of expert governance isn't as foreign to contemporary experience as it might initially appear. Most successful organizations, corporations, hospitals, universities, military units, are run by people who have demonstrated competence in relevant fields rather than by people who win popularity contests. We expect airplane pilots to understand aviation, surgeons to understand anatomy, and engineers to understand physics. The idea that government should also be conducted by people who understand economics, international relations, and public policy is inherently unreasonable. The challenge, of course, is figuring out how to identify and select such leaders without creating systems that are vulnerable to corruption or that lack accountability to the people they govern. Plato acknowledged this difficulty and spent considerable effort thinking about educational and institutional arrangements that might produce competent, virtuous leaders while preventing the abuse of power. His proposed system included extensive education for future leaders, starting in childhood and continuing throughout their careers. Potential rulers would need to demonstrate excellence in mathematics, philosophy, and practical administration. They would be prohibited from accumulating private wealth and would live communally to reduce temptations toward corruption. Most importantly, they would be required to spend years in direct contact with ordinary citizens, understanding their needs and perspectives before assuming positions of authority. These institutional safeguards were designed to address the fundamental problem that Plato identified in all political systems: the tendency for power to corrupt those who exercise it. Democratic systems try to solve this problem through regular elections, but Plato argued that this creates different forms of corruption. The corruption of leaders who pander to popular prejudices rather than pursuing genuine solutions, and the corruption of citizens who expect easy answers to complex problems. Plato's political philosophy remains controversial because it challenges fundamental assumptions about equality and popular sovereignty that are central to modern democratic ideology. But his analysis of democratic pathologies has proven remarkably prescient. The problems he identified, the elevation of opinion over knowledge, the success of demagogues who appeal to emotion rather than reason, the short-term bias of electoral politics, the influence of wealthy interests on policymaking, are more evident today than they were in ancient Athens. Contemporary political science has largely confirmed Plato's insights about the limitations of democratic decision-making. Studies consistently show that voters have very limited knowledge about basic political facts, that their policy preferences are often inconsistent and poorly informed, and that their voting behavior is heavily influenced by irrelevant factors like candidate appearance, partisan identity, and recent economic performance. This doesn't mean that democracy should be abandoned, but it does suggest that democratic systems need to be designed more carefully to account for their inherent limitations. Some possibilities include creating deliberative assemblies of randomly selected citizens who receive extensive information about policy issues, establishing independent expert bodies to evaluate policy proposals, or requiring supermajority votes for major policy changes to prevent impulsive decision-making. The deeper message of Plato's political philosophy is that good government requires more than good intentions or popular support. It requires wisdom, virtue, and competence that are rare and difficult to develop. Creating political systems that promote these qualities while preventing the abuse of power remains one of humanity's greatest challenges. Plato's analysis doesn't provide easy answers, but it asks the right questions and helps us understand why political reform is so difficult and so important. His critique of democracy is ultimately a critique of human nature itself. Our tendency toward wishful thinking, our susceptibility to emotional manipulation, our preference for simple answers over complex truths. These limitations don't make democracy impossible, but they do make it much more difficult than most people assume. Plato's enduring contribution is helping us understand what we're up against when we try to create just and effective political institutions in a world where wisdom is scarce and self-interest is powerful. Part 6. The Mind and Reality, Ancient Consciousness Studies. Long before neuroscientists began mapping brain activity and cognitive researchers started studying consciousness, Plato was asking the fundamental questions that still drive cutting-edge research in psychology, neuroscience, and artificial intelligence. What is the relationship between mind and matter? How do we acquire knowledge? What makes consciousness possible? Are there aspects of reality that exist independently of our physical brains? His answers to these questions were so sophisticated and prescient that they continue to influence scientific and philosophical debates over 2 millennia later. Plato's theory of forms represents one of the most ambitious attempts in intellectual history to explain how abstract thinking is possible. The basic problem he was trying to solve is still puzzling researchers today. How can physical brains, made of neurons and chemicals, understand abstract concepts like justice, beauty, mathematics, or truth? These concepts don't seem to exist anywhere in the physical world, yet human minds can grasp them, reason about them, and use them to understand concrete situations. Consider mathematical knowledge as an example. When you understand that 2 + 2 = 4, where exactly does this knowledge exist? It's not stored in any particular location in your brain. Neuroscientists can't point to specific neurons that contain the concept of 4. The equation isn't true because of any physical fact about a specific object in the world. It remains true whether you're counting apples, people, or abstract units. Mathematical truths seem to exist in a realm that transcends both individual minds and physical reality, yet human consciousness can somehow access and understand them. Plato's solution was to propose that abstract concepts exist in a realm of perfect forms, or ideas that exist independently of both physical reality and individual minds. The physical world that we experience through our senses is like a shadow or imperfect copy of this realm of forms. When we recognize that a particular action is just or unjust, we're comparing to our innate understanding of perfect justice. When we see that a mathematical proof is valid, we're recognizing its correspondence to perfect mathematical relationships that exist in the realm of forms. This might sound like mystical speculation, but Plato was actually trying to solve a genuine puzzle about human cognition that contemporary researchers are still struggling to understand. How do children learn language so quickly and effectively? How do scientists discover mathematical relationships that seem to exist independently of human thought? How do people from different cultures and historical periods often converge on similar moral insights? Plato's theory of forms was an early attempt to explain these phenomena by proposing that human minds have some kind of access to abstract patterns or structures that exist independently of physical reality. Modern cognitive science has rediscovered many of Plato's insights about the nature of learning and knowledge. Noam Chomsky's theory of universal grammar, for instance, argues that children are born with an innate understanding of grammatical structures that enables them to learn any human language. This innate linguistic knowledge doesn't come from experience. Children master grammatical rules that they've never been explicitly taught and that are too complex to derive from the limited linguistic input they receive. Chomsky's theory sounds remarkably similar to Plato's doctrine of recollection, which holds that learning is actually a process of remembering knowledge that the soul possessed before birth. In Plato's dialogue Meno, Socrates demonstrates this principle by leading an untutored slave boy through a geometric proof. The boy discovers a solution not because Socrates teaches him new information, but because careful questioning helps him recognize mathematical relationships that he already understood at some level. Contemporary research on mathematical cognition has revealed similar phenomena. Children seem to have an innate number sense that enables them to understand basic arithmetic concepts before they receive formal mathematical education. They can distinguish between small numbers, understand that adding increases quantity, and grasp simple geometric relationships without being explicitly taught these concepts. This suggests that mathematical knowledge might indeed involve recognition of abstract patterns that exist independently of individual learning experiences. The field of evolutionary psychology has provided another angle on Plato's insights about innate knowledge. Researchers have identified numerous cognitive capacities that appear to be universal across human cultures and that develop reliably without specific training. These include the ability to recognize faces, understand basic physics concepts like object permanence and causation, navigate social hierarchies, and make moral judgments about fairness and harm. These findings suggest that human minds come equipped with something like Plato's forms, innate templates or patterns that enable us to understand and navigate both physical and social reality. The specific content of these templates may have been shaped by evolutionary history rather than existing in a transcendent realm, but their function is remarkably similar to what Plato described. They provide a conceptual framework that makes learning and understanding possible. Plato's analysis of consciousness itself was equally prescient. He recognized that conscious experience involves more than just passive reception of sensory information. It requires active interpretation, organization, and understanding. The mind doesn't simply mirror external reality like a camera or recording device. Instead, it actively constructs our experienced reality by organizing sensory input according to conceptual categories and interpretive frameworks. This insight anticipates much of what contemporary neuroscience has discovered about perception and consciousness. We now know that the brain doesn't passively receive visual information. It actively constructs visual experience through complex processes of pattern recognition, expectation, and interpretation. What we see is not simply what's out there in the world, but the result of sophisticated neural computations that organize raw sensory data into meaningful perceptual experiences. The phenomenon of change blindness provides a striking example of how consciousness involves active construction rather than passive reception. Researchers have found that people often fail to notice large changes in their visual environment if those changes occur during brief interruptions or distractions. This suggests that conscious visual experience is much more selective and interpretive than it subjectively appears to be. We see what our brains expect and attend to, not everything that's actually present in our visual field. Plato understood that this constructive nature of consciousness has profound implications for our understanding of knowledge and reality. If the mind actively shapes our experience of the world, then we can't simply assume that our perceptions and beliefs correspond directly to external reality. This insight led him to develop sophisticated epistemological theories about the difference between knowledge and mere opinion, between appearance and reality, and between understanding and simple information processing. The famous analogy of the divided line in the Republic presents Plato's analysis of different levels of cognitive activity. At the lowest level are images and shadows, representations that are twice removed from reality. Next come physical objects that cast these shadows. Above that is mathematical reasoning, which deals with abstract relationships. At the highest level is dialectical thinking, which grasps the fundamental principles that make all other forms of knowledge possible. This hierarchy corresponds remarkably well to contemporary understanding of different types of cognitive processing. Neuroscientists distinguish between automatic, unconscious processing and controlled, conscious reasoning. They've identified different neural networks involved in perceptual processing, working memory, abstract reasoning, and metacognitive reflection. The progression from simple perception to complex abstract reasoning that Plato described matches what we now know about the developmental and evolutionary emergence of different cognitive capacities. Plato's theory also anticipated contemporary debates about the relationship between consciousness and physical reality. The hard problem of consciousness, explaining how subjective conscious experience can arise from objective physical processes, was clearly articulated in Plato's dialogues. He recognized that there seems to be an explanatory gap between physical events in the brain and the subjective, first-person experience of consciousness. This led Plato to propose a dualistic view of human nature, distinguishing between the physical body and the immaterial soul. The soul, in his view, was the seat of consciousness, reasoning, and personal identity. Unlike the body, which was subject to decay and death, the soul was eternal and indestructible. This allowed Plato to explain how abstract knowledge was possible. The soul could survive bodily death and carry knowledge from one lifetime to another. Modern neuroscience has moved away from this dualistic framework, seeking to explain consciousness entirely in terms of physical brain processes. But the fundamental problem that motivated Plato's dualism, the difficulty of explaining subjective experience in terms of objective physical events, remains unsolved. Contemporary researchers like David Chalmers have reformulated Plato's concerns in modern terms, arguing that current neuroscientific approaches may be fundamentally inadequate for explaining consciousness. The debate over artificial intelligence provides another context in which Plato's insights about mind and reality remain relevant. As computer systems become increasingly sophisticated, researchers are confronting basic questions about the nature of intelligence, understanding, and consciousness that Plato first articulated. Can machines truly understand language and concepts, or are they simply manipulating symbols according to programmed rules? What would it mean for an artificial system to have genuine knowledge rather than just access to information? Plato's analysis suggests that genuine understanding requires more than just the ability to process information or produce correct responses to questions. It requires grasping the underlying principles and relationships that make knowledge possible. A system that could answer questions about justice without understanding what justice actually is would be trapped in what Plato called the realm of shadows. It could manipulate representations without accessing the reality they represent. The recent development of large language models like GPT-3 and ChatGPT has made these questions more pressing. These systems can produce remarkably human-like responses to complex questions, but it's unclear whether they actually understand the concepts they're discussing or are simply generating statistically plausible combinations of words based on their training data. The Turing test, which evaluates machine intelligence based on the ability to fool human judges, doesn't address the deeper question of whether apparent intelligence reflects genuine understanding. Plato would likely argue that true artificial intelligence would require more than just sophisticated information processing. It would require access to the abstract patterns and principles that make understanding possible. This might involve developing artificial systems that can engage in something like Plato's dialectical reasoning, the ability to examine assumptions, trace logical implications, and grasp fundamental principles that underlie specific knowledge claims. The simulation hypothesis, popularized by philosopher Nick Bostrom, provides a contemporary version of Plato's concerns about the relationship between appearance and reality. If advanced civilizations can create detailed simulations of reality, how can we know whether we're living in the real world or in a computer simulation? This question echoes Plato's allegory of the cave. We might be mistaking shadows for reality without realizing our predicament. The simulation hypothesis also connects to Plato's broader concerns about the reliability of sensory experience. If our perceived reality could be entirely artificial, then we need methods for distinguishing between authentic knowledge and mere appearance that don't depend solely on sensory evidence. This returns us to Plato's emphasis on rational reflection, logical analysis, and dialectical reasoning as tools for understanding reality. Quantum mechanics has introduced additional complexities into our understanding of the relationship between consciousness and reality. Some interpretations of quantum theory suggest that conscious observation plays a fundamental role in determining physical events, a possibility that would have intrigued Plato. If consciousness actually influences physical reality rather than simply observing it, then the relationship between mind and world becomes even more complex than Plato imagined. The measurement problem in quantum mechanics, the question of how definite physical events emerge from quantum probabilities, parallels Plato's concerns about how abstract possibilities become concrete realities. Some physicists have proposed that consciousness might be the mechanism through which potential quantum states become actual observed phenomena, giving mind a fundamental role in the structure of physical reality. These contemporary developments in science and technology haven't resolved the fundamental questions that Plato raised about consciousness, knowledge, and reality. If anything, they've made those questions more complex and pressing. As we develop more sophisticated tools for studying the brain and creating artificial intelligence, we're confronting the same basic puzzles about the nature of mind and its relationship to physical reality that occupied Plato over 2 millennia ago. Plato's enduring contribution is not any particular theory or doctrine, but his recognition that these questions are fundamental to understanding human nature and our place in the universe. His willingness to follow arguments wherever they led, even when they challenged common sense or led to unsettling conclusions, provides a model for how to approach the deep mysteries of consciousness and reality that continue to challenge human understanding. Part 7, Education Revolution. Why schools still uses methods. Walk into any good law school classroom and you'll witness something that will be instantly familiar to Plato. A professor asking probing questions, students struggling to articulate their assumptions, ideas being challenged and refined through dialogue, and knowledge emerging not from lecture, but from the dynamic process of inquiry itself. This is a Socratic method in action, and it represents perhaps Plato's most practical and enduring contribution to human civilization. Yet most people have no idea that every time a teacher asks, "What do you think?" instead of simply providing information, they're channeling educational insights that are nearly 2,500 years old. Plato didn't just theorize about education. He revolutionized it. His academy, founded in 387 BCE, was the world's first university, and its pedagogical innovations continue to shape how we think about learning, teaching, and intellectual development. But Plato's educational philosophy goes far deeper than institutional structures or teaching techniques. He developed a comprehensive theory of how human minds develop, what genuine learning involves, and why education is essential for both individual flourishing and social justice. The foundation of Plato's educational philosophy is his recognition that real learning is fundamentally different from information transfer. Most people think of education as a process where knowledgeable teachers deposit information into the minds of ignorant students, like filling empty containers with content. But Plato understood that authentic learning involves the active construction of understanding through personal intellectual effort. You cannot simply tell someone how to think critically, solve complex problems, or make ethical judgments. These capacities must be developed through practice, reflection, and sustained engagement with challenging material. This insight is captured in Plato's famous metaphor of the teacher as midwife. Just as a midwife doesn't create the baby but helps bring forth what is already developing within the mother, a good teacher doesn't create knowledge in students but helps them discover and articulate understanding that emerges from their own thinking. This midwifery model explains why the Socratic method is so effective and why it has remained central to education in fields that require sophisticated reasoning and judgment. The Socratic method, as developed by Plato from his teacher's practice, involves asking carefully sequenced questions designed to expose assumptions, reveal contradictions, and guide students toward clearer thinking. Instead of providing answers, Socratic teachers create conditions where students must think for themselves, examine their beliefs, and construct coherent positions through rational analysis. This approach is based on a profound insight that people learn most effectively when they actively participate in the process of discovery, rather than passively receiving pre-packaged conclusions. Modern educational psychology has confirmed many of Plato's insights about how learning actually works. Research consistently shows that active learning techniques produce better outcomes than traditional lecture-based instruction. Students who engage in problem-solving, discussion, and hands-on activities demonstrate deeper understanding and better retention than those who simply listen to presentations of information. The constructivist learning theory, developed by researchers like Jean Piaget and Levi Vygotsky, echoes Plato's understanding that learners must actively build their own knowledge structures through interaction with challenging material and social dialogue. The flipped classroom model, which has gained popularity in recent years, represents a contemporary application of Platonic principles. Instead of using class time for lectures and assigning homework for practice, flipped classrooms have students encounter basic information through readings or videos before class, then use face-to-face time for discussion, problem-solving, and collaborative inquiry. This approach recognizes that the most valuable learning happens when students actively wrestle with ideas rather than passively consume information. Plato's educational philosophy also emphasized the importance of interdisciplinary learning. His academy didn't separate subjects into isolated departments, but treated mathematics, philosophy, natural science, politics, and ethics as interconnected domains of knowledge that illuminate each other. Students were expected to see connections between abstract mathematical reasoning and concrete political problems, between ethical principles and scientific methodology, between artistic creation and philosophical understanding. This holistic approach to education reflects Plato's understanding that reality itself is interconnected and that genuine wisdom requires the ability to see relationships between apparently separate domains of knowledge. A person who understands geometry but cannot apply mathematical reasoning to ethical problems, or who knows historical facts but cannot think critically about contemporary political issues, has acquired information but not education in Plato's sense. Contemporary educational reform movements have rediscovered the value of interdisciplinary learning. STEAM education, science, technology, engineering, arts, and mathematics, attempts to break down artificial barriers between subjects and help students see how different domains of knowledge connect each other and to real-world problems. Project-based learning engages students in complex, multifaceted challenges that require integration of knowledge from multiple fields. These approaches reflect the same insight that motivated Plato's integrated curriculum. Genuine understanding requires the ability to make connections across traditional disciplinary boundaries. Plato also understood that effective education must be personalized to individual students' needs, abilities, and learning styles. The Republic describes an educational system that would identify students' natural talents and provide specialized training appropriate to their capabilities and interests. Some students would be suited for practical crafts and trades, others for military and administrative roles, and a select few for the kind of philosophical reasoning required for leadership and governance. This differentiated approach to education might sound elitist or deterministic, but Plato's actual position was more nuanced and progressive than critics often acknowledge. He argued that educational opportunities should be based on demonstrated ability and achievement rather than social class or family background. In his ideal system, the children of farmers could rise to positions of leadership if they showed the necessary intellectual and moral qualifications, while the children of rulers could find themselves assigned to practical trades if they lacked the capacities for philosophical reasoning. This meritocratic vision was revolutionary in ancient Greece, where social position was typically determined by birth rather than ability. Plato's academy admitted women as students and teachers, which was virtually unprecedented in Greek society. His educational philosophy challenged the assumption that learning capacity was fixed by gender, social class, or ethnic background, arguing instead that education should develop whatever potential each individual possessed. Modern educational systems have struggled to implement Plato's insight about personalized learning while maintaining democratic principles of equal opportunity. Tracking systems that separate students into different academic paths based on ability have often reproduced social inequalities rather than providing genuine meritocratic advancement. But contemporary developments in educational technology may finally make truly personalized learning possible on a large scale. Adaptive learning systems can adjust the pace, content, and style of instruction to individual students' needs and progress. Artificial intelligence can identify when students are struggling with particular concepts and provide additional support or alternative explanations. Virtual reality and simulation technologies can create immersive learning experiences tailored to different learning preferences and interests. These technologies offer the possibility of implementing Plato's vision of education that develops each person's unique potential while maintaining democratic access and opportunity. Plato's understanding of the relationship between education and democracy was complex and prescient. He recognized that democratic societies depend on citizens who can think critically, evaluate competing claims, and make informed judgments about complex issues. But he also understood that democracy creates pressures that can undermine genuine education. Politicians have incentives to tell voters what they want to hear rather than what they need to know. Educational institutions may focus more on popularity and enrollment than on rigorous intellectual development. Students may prefer entertaining and easy classes over challenging ones that require sustained effort and concentration. This tension between democratic pressures and educational excellence remains visible in contemporary debates about higher education. Universities face pressure to treat students as customers whose satisfaction must be maintained, potentially compromising academic rigor for student retention. Grade inflation has become common as institutions compete for students and rankings. The rise of student evaluations as measures of teaching effectiveness has created incentives for professors to entertain rather than challenge their students. Plato would have recognized these problems as predictable consequences of applying market principles to educational institutions. Just as consumers don't always choose products that are best for their long-term health, students don't always gravitate toward classes and majors that will develop their intellectual capacities most effectively. Democratic feedback mechanisms that work reasonably well in other domains may be counterproductive when applied to education, where expertise and experience should guide decisions about curriculum and pedagogy. The solution is not to abandon democratic principles in education, but to structure educational institutions in ways that protect academic integrity while remaining responsive to legitimate student needs and social demands. This requires what Plato would call philosophical leadership, administrators and faculty who understand the purpose and methods of genuine education and who have the courage to maintain academic standards even when doing so is unpopular or financially costly. Professional schools have maintained stronger connections to Platonic educational principles than many undergraduate programs. Medical schools, law schools, and business schools continue to use case-based learning, Socratic questioning, and experiential education because these fields require the kind of practical wisdom that can only be developed through active engagement with complex, realistic problems. Students in these programs expect to be challenged, to have their assumptions questioned, and to develop sophisticated reasoning abilities rather than simply acquiring information. The success of professional education in maintaining rigorous standards suggests that Plato's educational philosophy works best when students understand why they need to develop particular capacities and when they're motivated to put in the effort required for genuine learning. This insight has implications for how we might reform undergraduate education to be more engaging and effective. Liberal arts education, at its best, embodies Platonic principles by exposing students to fundamental questions about knowledge, reality, ethics, and human nature that don't have simple answers but require sustained intellectual engagement. The goal is not to provide students with a specific set of facts or skills, but to develop their capacities for critical thinking, ethical reasoning, and creative problem solving that will serve them regardless of their particular career paths. But liberal arts education has struggled to justify its value in an increasingly vocational and economic approach to higher education. Students and parents often view college primarily as job training rather than intellectual development, leading to pressure for immediately practical courses and measurable outcomes. This utilitarian approach to education misses what Plato understood as education's most important function: developing human potential and creating citizens capable of contributing to just and flourishing communities. The rise of online education has created new opportunities to implement Platonic educational principles on a large scale. Well-designed online courses can provide the kind of personalized, interactive learning experiences that Plato advocated. Discussion forums can facilitate Socratic dialogue among students from diverse backgrounds and geographic locations. Multimedia resources can present complex ideas in multiple formats to accommodate different learning styles. Automated feedback systems can guide students through problem-solving processes without simply providing answers. But online education also faces challenges that Plato would have anticipated. The physical separation between teachers and students makes it harder to build the kind of personal relationships that motivate deep learning. The flexibility of online formats can enable procrastination and superficial engagement rather than the sustained effort that genuine education requires. The scalability of online courses creates pressure to standardize content and assessment in ways that may undermine personalized learning. The key to successful online education, from a Platonic perspective, is maintaining focus on active learning, critical thinking, and personal intellectual development rather than simply delivering information more efficiently. This requires thoughtful course design, skill facilitation, and institutional commitment to educational excellence rather than just technological innovation. Plato's most important contribution to educational theory may be his recognition that education is fundamentally about human transformation rather than information acquisition. Good education changes how people think, what they value, and how they engage with the world around them. It develops capacities for wisdom, virtue, and creative contribution that enhance both individual lives and social communities. This transformative vision of education offers a powerful alternative to contemporary approaches that treat learning as a consumer good, students as customers, and educational institutions as businesses competing in academic markets. Plato understood that genuine education requires commitment, effort, and sacrifice from both teachers and students, but he also knew that it provides rewards that transcend immediate utility or economic value. The enduring influence of Platonic educational principles in law schools, medical schools, graduate programs, and the best undergraduate institutions demonstrates that his insights about learning and teaching remain valid and valuable. As we continue to grapple with questions about how to prepare people for rapidly changing economic and social conditions, Plato's emphasis on developing fundamental capacities for reasoning, judgment, and ethical reflection provides guidance that transcends particular historical circumstances. The challenge is to implement these principles in educational institutions that are democratic, accessible, and responsive to diverse student needs while maintaining the intellectual rigor and transformative potential that make education worthwhile. This requires the kind of philosophical wisdom that Plato spent his life developing and teaching, the ability to see beyond immediate pressures and popular opinions to understand what human beings really need to flourish as individuals and as members of communities. Part 8. Debunking the biggest myths. For over 2,000 years, Plato has been one of history's most misunderstood thinkers. Generations of students have been taught caricatures of a philosophy that bear little resemblance to his actual positions. Politicians have invoked his name to justify authoritarian policies he would have opposed. Critics have attacked him for views he never held. The result is a collection of myths about Plato that have become so deeply entrenched in popular culture that most people think they know what he believed without ever having seriously engaged with his actual writings. These misunderstandings aren't just academic curiosities. They prevented countless people from discovering one of the most relevant and transformative bodies of thought ever produced. When you strip away the myths and encounter the real Plato, you find a thinker whose insights into politics, education, psychology, and human nature are startlingly contemporary and urgently needed. But first, we need to demolish the false versions of Plato that have dominated public discourse for far too long. The most persistent myth about Plato is that he was an enemy of art and creativity who wanted to ban poets and artists from his ideal society. This misunderstanding stems from a superficial reading of a few passages in the Republic, where Plato discusses a relationship between art and truth. Critics have seized on these passages to portray him as a humorless authoritarian who feared the power of artistic expression and wanted to create a society of mindless conformity. The reality is far more complex and interesting. Plato wasn't opposed to art. He was concerned about bad art and its effects on people who couldn't distinguish between artistic representation and reality. His critique targeted artists who presented false or harmful images of gods, heroes, and moral behavior without any concern for truth or social responsibility. He was particularly worried about popular entertainment that glorified violence, promoted shallow values, and manipulated emotions without developing understanding or wisdom. This concern sounds remarkably contemporary when you consider the current debates about violence in video games, the influence of social media on young people's self-image, and the spread of misinformation through entertaining but factually dubious content. Plato anticipated these problems by over 2 millennia, recognizing that powerful artistic and communicative technologies could be used to manipulate public opinion and distort people's understanding of reality. Plato's actual position on art was nuanced and appreciative. He wrote his own philosophical works in dramatic dialogue form, demonstrating his understanding of how literary techniques could serve philosophical purposes. He frequently used metaphors, analogies, and mythical stories to illuminate abstract concepts. His famous allegory of the cave is itself a work of artistic imagination that has inspired countless writers, filmmakers, and artists throughout history. What Plato objected to was not artistic creativity itself, but the irresponsible use of artistic power. He believed that artists, like teachers and political leaders, had ethical obligations to consider the effect of their work on audiences and society. This doesn't mean he wanted to impose rigid censorship or eliminate creative freedom. Rather, he wanted artists to take their social influence seriously and to use their talents in ways that promoted truth, beauty, and human flourishing rather than deception, superficiality, and social discord. The second major myth portrays Plato as a totalitarian who designed a blueprint for authoritarian government in the Republic. This interpretation has been promoted by critics like Karl Popper, who argue that Plato's political philosophy led directly to modern fascism and communism. According to this view, Plato wanted to create a rigid class system where philosopher kings exercise absolute power over passive, obedient citizens who have no individual rights or freedoms. This reading completely misses the actual purpose and content of the Republic. Plato wasn't trying to design a practical political system that could be implemented in the real world. He was conducting a thought experiment designed to explore the nature of justice by imagining what a perfectly just society might look like. The extreme features of his ideal republic, communal property, selective breeding, noble lies, were not policy recommendations, but analytical tools for understanding what justice requires and why it's so difficult to achieve in practice. Moreover, Plato's ideal rulers, the philosopher kings, bear no resemblance to actual dictators or totalitarian leaders. They don't seek power for personal gain, don't accumulate wealth or privileges, and don't rule through force or propaganda. Instead, they're characterized by their commitment to truth, their concern for justice, and their reluctance to exercise political authority. They become rulers only because they're the most qualified to promote the common good, not because they desire power or believe they're superior to other people. The third myth presents Plato as a completely impractical idealist who is disconnected from real-world concerns and obsessed with abstract theories that have no relevance to actual human problems. This view portrays him as the archetypal ivory tower intellectual who spends his time contemplating perfect forms while ignoring the messy realities of political, social, and personal life. This characterization is particularly ironic given that Plato was deeply engaged with the practical problems of his time and repeatedly risked his safety by attempting to implement his ideas in real political situations. He made 3 dangerous trips to Sicily to advise rulers and attempt political reforms. He founded and ran the Academy, which was not just a theoretical institution, but a practical training ground for future leaders. His dialogues constantly address concrete questions about how people should live, how society should be organized, and how individuals can develop wisdom and virtue. Plato's so-called abstract theories were actually sophisticated attempts to understand practical problems. His theory of forms wasn't meant to be a mystical doctrine about transcendent reality, but an explanation of how abstract thinking and moral reasoning are possible. His political philosophy emerged from his direct experience of democratic failure and political corruption. His educational theories were based on decades of actual teaching and institutional management. The 4th myth suggests that Plato was an elitist who believed that only a small group of specially gifted individuals could attain wisdom or virtue, while the masses were condemned to ignorance and moral mediocrity. This interpretation presents his philosophy as fundamentally anti-democratic and incompatible with modern principles of human equality and individual dignity. While Plato certainly believed that people have different capacities and that not everyone is suited for philosophical reasoning or political leadership, his actual position was far more egalitarian than this myth suggests. He argued that educational and political opportunities should be based on demonstrated ability and character rather than social class, family background, or economic status. His academy admitted women and foreigners, which was revolutionary in ancient Greek society. He believed that anyone who devoted sufficient effort to philosophical study could develop significant wisdom and virtue. More fundamentally, Plato's apparent elitism was actually motivated by democratic concern for protecting ordinary citizens from manipulation by incompetent or corrupt leaders. He had witnessed how demagogues could exploit democratic processes to gain power, and then use that power to harm the very people who had elected them. His solution wasn't to deny political rights to ordinary citizens, but to ensure that those who exercised political authority were actually qualified to do so. The 5th myth portrays Plato as an enemy of individual freedom who wanted to subordinate personal desires and choices to collective social goals. This interpretation suggests that his ideal society would eliminate privacy, personal relationships, and individual autonomy in favor of totalitarian control over every aspect of citizens' lives. This misunderstanding stems from focusing exclusively on the most extreme features of the ideal republic, while ignoring Plato's broader philosophy of human nature and individual development. Plato actually placed enormous emphasis on individual flourishing and self-realization. His entire educational philosophy was based on helping each person discover and develop their unique potential. His ethics focused on how individuals could live flourishing, meaningful lives through the cultivation of wisdom and virtue. The apparent tension between individual freedom and social responsibility in Plato's thought reflects a sophisticated understanding that genuine freedom requires more than just the absence of external constraints. True freedom involved the capacity to make rational, ethical choices based on understanding rather than being driven by unreflected desires or social pressures. A person who is addicted to drugs or manipulated by propaganda is not free in any meaningful sense, even if no one is directly coercing their behavior. Plato's political philosophy was designed to create conditions where genuine individual freedom could flourish. This required protecting people from manipulation and exploitation, providing education that develops critical thinking abilities, and ensuring that social institutions promote rather than undermine human flourishing. These goals may sometimes require limiting certain types of individual choice, but only protect the more fundamental freedom to live rational, ethical, fulfilling lives. The 6th myth presents Plato as a rigid dogmatist who claimed to have final answers to all philosophical questions and expected his students to accept his doctrines without question. This interpretation portrays the academy as a kind of philosophical seminary where students memorized orthodox positions rather than engaging in independent inquiry. This view completely misunderstands Plato's actual method and approach to philosophical questions. His dialogues almost never reach definitive conclusions. Instead, They model the process of philosophical inquiry by showing how careful questioning can expose problems with common assumptions and lead to deeper understanding. The Socratic method that Plato developed and refined was specifically designed to promote independent thinking rather than passive acceptance of authority. Plato's willingness to follow arguments wherever they led, even when they challenged his own previous positions or reached uncomfortable conclusions, demonstrates his commitment to rational inquiry over dogmatic certainty. Many of his dialogues end in aporia, a state of productive confusion, where participants recognize the inadequacy of their initial beliefs but haven't yet reached new understanding. This reflects Plato's insight that recognizing one's ignorance is often the first step toward genuine wisdom. The seventh myth suggests that Plato's philosophy is inherently anti-scientific and hostile to empirical investigation of the natural world. This interpretation presents him as a mystic who preferred abstract speculation to careful observation and experimentation. In reality, Plato was deeply interested in natural science and mathematics, and his academy was one of the most important centers of scientific research in the ancient world. Many of the greatest mathematicians and astronomers of his era were associated with the academy. Plato himself made significant contributions to mathematical education and encouraged his students to pursue rigorous investigation of natural phenomena. Plato's critique of relying exclusively on sensory experience was not motivated by hostility to empirical investigation, but by recognition that observation must be guided by rational analysis to yield genuine knowledge. This insight has been confirmed by modern philosophy of science, which recognizes that scientific theories involve much more than simple accumulation of observational data. Theoretical frameworks, mathematical analysis, and conceptual clarity are essential components of scientific understanding. The eighth and perhaps most damaging myth presents Plato as irrelevant to contemporary concerns, an ancient thinker whose ideas may have been interesting in their historical context, but have no bearing on modern problems. This view treats his philosophy as a museum piece that might be worth studying for its historical significance, but offers no insights for addressing current challenges. This myth is particularly pernicious because it prevents people from discovering how remarkably contemporary Plato's concerns and insights actually are. His analysis of how media and popular culture can distort people's understanding of reality is more relevant today than ever before. His warnings about the dangers of democratic demagoguery perfectly describe contemporary political developments. His insights into education, relationships, and personal development anticipate much of what psychology and social science have discovered about human nature and flourishing. The persistence of these myths about Plato reveals something important about how intellectual history gets distorted and misrepresented. Complex thinkers get reduced to simple caricatures that are easier to dismiss than to engage with seriously. Controversial ideas get stripped of their nuance and context, making them appear more extreme or simplistic than they actually were. Political and ideological considerations influence how past thinkers are interpreted, leading to systematic misrepresentation of their actual positions. Breaking through these myths requires return to Plato's actual texts and engaging with his arguments in their full complexity and context. This doesn't mean accepting everything he wrote uncritically, but it does mean taking his ideas seriously enough to understand what he was actually trying to accomplish. When you do this, you discover a thinker whose sophistication, insight, and relevance have been obscured by centuries of misinterpretation and oversimplification. The real Plato is far more interesting, challenging, and useful than any of the myths that have grown up around his name. He was a revolutionary educator who developed teaching methods still used in the best schools today. He was a penetrating analyst of political pathology who understood problems that continue to plague democratic societies. He was a sophisticated psychologist who anticipated many insights about human nature and consciousness that we're still trying to fully understand. Most importantly, he was a thinker who understood that philosophy's ultimate purpose is not academic speculation, but practical wisdom, the kind of understanding that helps people live better lives and create more just societies. This practical orientation has been obscured by academic interpretations that focus more on theoretical consistency than on real-world application, but remains central to what makes Plato's philosophy valuable and transformative. Debunking the myths about Plato isn't just an exercise in historical accuracy. It's a way of reclaiming intellectual resources that we desperately need for addressing contemporary challenges. The problems Plato grappled with, political manipulation educational mediocrity, social fragmentation, moral confusion haven't disappeared. If anything, they've become more urgent and complex in our interconnected, rapidly changing world. We need Plato's analytical tools, his commitment to rigorous thinking, and his vision of human potential more than ever. But we can only benefit from his insights if we're willing to move beyond the comfortable myths that make him seem safely irrelevant and encounter the challenging, transformative thinker who emerges from his actual writings. That encounter requires effort, intellectual humility, and openness to having our assumptions challenged. Exactly the qualities that Plato believed were essential for wisdom and human flourishing. Part 9. Why Plato matters more than ever. We live in an age that would have been instantly recognizable to Plato as a time of crisis and opportunity. Our democratic institutions are under assault from demagogues who manipulate public opinion through lies and emotional appeals. Our information environment is dominated by systems designed to capture attention rather than promote understanding. Our educational institutions struggle to develop critical thinking in a culture that rewards quick answers over deep reflection. Our relationships are mediated by technologies that prioritize superficial connections over meaningful intimacy. These challenges would not surprise Plato. He predicted them all. But Plato would also recognize the unprecedented opportunities of our moment. We have access to more information and diverse perspectives than any previous generation. We can communicate instantly with people across the globe. We have scientific tools for understanding human nature and social dynamics that were unimaginable in ancient Athens. We have technologies that could revolutionize education, enhance democratic participation, and create new forms of human connection. The question is whether we have the wisdom to use these tools well. Exactly the kind of question that Plato devoted his life to exploring. The contemporary relevance of Plato's insights becomes clear when you examine the specific challenges facing modern societies. Consider the crisis of expertise that characterizes much of contemporary political discourse. In field after field, climate science, public health, economics, international relations, we see a growing tendency to treat expert knowledge as just another opinion, no more valuable than uninformed speculation or wishful thinking. This collapse of epistemic authority has contributed to policy disasters, social fragmentation, and the erosion of shared standards for evaluating truth claims. Plato understood that this would happen in democratic societies unless citizens developed the intellectual virtues necessary to distinguish between knowledge and mere opinion. His theory of knowledge wasn't an abstract philosophical exercise. It was a practical framework for helping people navigate a world full of competing claims and unreliable sources of information. His distinction between the realm of appearances and the realm of reality provides tools for recognizing when we're being manipulated by shadows on the cave wall, rather than engaging with genuine understanding. The rise of artificial intelligence and algorithmic decision-making has made Plato's questions about the nature of knowledge and understanding more urgent than ever. As machines become increasingly sophisticated at processing information and generating human-like responses, we need frameworks for distinguishing between genuine intelligence and clever simulation. Plato's analysis of what separates authentic knowledge from mere information processing provides crucial guidance for these developments. His insight that true understanding involves grasping underlying principles and relationships, not just manipulating symbols or data, helps explain why even the most advanced AI systems often fail when confronted with novel situations or questions that require genuine comprehension rather than pattern matching. The Turing test measures whether machines can fool humans into thinking they're intelligent, but Plato would ask the deeper question: what would it mean for a machine to actually understand rather than just simulate understanding? The attention economy that dominates contemporary media and technology represents a perfect example of what Plato warned about when he described how people could become imprisoned by shadows on a cave wall. Social media platforms, streaming services, news organizations, and advertising companies have created sophisticated systems for capturing and monetizing human attention. These systems are designed to keep users engaged, not to promote understanding, wisdom, or genuine human flourishing. The psychological effects of this attention economy, increased anxiety, depression, social comparison, and political polarization, would have been entirely predictable to someone who understood Plato's analysis of how the soul relates to external influences. He recognized that what we pay attention to shapes who we become, and that societies have a responsibility to create information environments that promote rather than undermine human development. Plato's educational philosophy offers practical alternatives to the current crisis in learning and development. His emphasis on active inquiry rather than passive consumption of information provides a framework for designing educational experiences that develop genuine understanding rather than mere information processing. His recognition that different people have different learning styles and capabilities suggests approaches to personalized education that could be implemented through contemporary technologies. The Socratic method, which Plato refined and systematized, remains one of the most effective techniques ever developed for promoting critical thinking and intellectual humility. In an age of polarization and ideological rigidity, we desperately need educational approaches that help people examine their assumptions, consider alternative perspectives, and develop the intellectual courage to change their minds when presented with better evidence or arguments. Contemporary debates about democracy and political participation would benefit enormously from engagement with Plato's political philosophy. His critique of democratic pathologies, the tendency towards short-term thinking, the susceptibility to demagogic manipulation, the elevation of opinion over expertise, provides insight into problems that have become acute in recent years. But his analysis also suggests constructive approaches to democratic reform that could address these problems without abandoning democratic principles. The concept of deliberative democracy, which emphasizes informed discussion and rational consideration of policy alternatives, reflects Platonic insights about the conditions necessary for good collective decision-making. Citizens' assemblies, which bring together randomly selected groups of people to study complex issues and make recommendations, represent practical applications of Plato's vision of how democratic participation could be improved through better institutional design and citizen education. Plato's understanding of the relationship between individual character and social institutions provides a framework for addressing many contemporary challenges. He recognized that just societies require citizens who have developed the intellectual and moral virtues necessary to participate constructively in collective life. This insight suggests that social reform must involve not just changes in laws and policies, but also cultural and educational changes that promote human development and ethical reasoning. The environmental crisis facing contemporary civilization represents exactly the kind of long-term, complex challenge that Plato understood democratic systems would struggle to address. Climate change requires coordinated global action based on scientific understanding rather than immediate local preferences. It demands sacrifice from current generations for the benefit of future ones. It involves trade-offs between economic growth and environmental protection that challenge fundamental assumptions about progress and development. Plato's analysis of the relationship between knowledge, virtue, and political action suggests that addressing environmental challenges will require not just technical solutions, but also fundamental changes in how people understand their relationship to nature and to future generations. His vision of education as transformative rather than merely informative provides guidance for the kind of consciousness change that effective environmental action requires. The crisis of meaning and purpose that characterizes much of contemporary life, rising rates of anxiety, depression, and suicide despite unprecedented material prosperity, reflects problems that Plato understood as fundamental to the human condition. He recognized that people need more than material security and sensory pleasure to live fulfilling lives. They need understanding, purpose, and connection to something greater than their individual desires and concerns. Plato's analysis of the different parts of the soul and their proper relationship provide a framework for understanding what genuine human flourishing involves. His recognition that reason, emotion, and desire must be integrated rather than in conflict offers insight into how people can develop psychological health and resilience. His emphasis on the pursuit of wisdom and virtue as sources of meaning provides an alternative to both hedonistic individualism and external sources of validation. The relationships crisis that affects many modern societies, increasing social isolation, declining marriage rates, difficulty forming lasting intimate partnerships, reflects problems that Plato's analysis of love and friendship helps illuminate. His understanding of how relationships can become vehicles for personal growth and mutual transformation offers alternatives to contemporary culture's emphasis on compatibility and individual satisfaction. Plato's recognition that the highest forms of love involve inspiring each other toward excellence provides guidance for creating relationships that enhance rather than diminish human potential. His insight that meaningful connections require vulnerability, commitment, and shared purpose challenges cultural assumptions about autonomy and self-sufficiency that may actually prevent the intimate connection people seek. The technological developments that characterize our era, artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, virtual reality, social media, raise fundamental questions about human nature and social organization that Plato was among the first to explore systematically. His analysis of the relationship between appearance and reality provides tools for evaluating how these technologies might enhance or distort human understanding and connection. His insights into education and human development suggest criteria for evaluating whether technological innovations actually improve human life or simply create more sophisticated forms of distraction and manipulation. His political philosophy provides frameworks for thinking about how these powerful technologies should be regulated and who should make decisions about their development and deployment. Perhaps most importantly, Plato's approach to philosophical inquiry itself provides a model for how to engage with the unprecedented challenges of our time. Rather than claiming to have final answers, he developed methods for asking better questions, examining assumptions more carefully, and thinking more rigorously about complex problems. His willingness to follow arguments wherever they led, even when the conclusions were uncomfortable or politically inconvenient, exemplifies the intellectual courage that our current challenges require. The Platonic approach to problem solving involves several key elements that remain relevant today. First, it requires stepping back from immediate pressures and popular opinions to examine underlying assumptions and principles. Second, it involves seeking understanding rather than just information, looking for patterns and relationships rather than isolated facts. Third, it emphasizes the importance of dialogue and collaborative inquiry, rather than individual speculation or ideological combat. Fourth, it recognizes that genuine solutions to complex problems often require personal transformation as well as external change. Fifth, it maintains that intellectual work is ultimately in service of practical wisdom, understanding that helps people live better lives and create more just societies. These principles provide guidance for approaching contemporary challenges with the kind of philosophical sophistication that their complexity requires. Plato's vision of human potential offers hope in an age that often seems dominated by cynicism and despair. He believed that people are capable of wisdom, virtue, and genuine understanding if they receive appropriate education and live in supportive social environments. This optimistic view of human nature doesn't ignore the reality of ignorance, vice, and social dysfunction, but it suggests that these problems are not inevitable features of the human condition. The practical implications of Platonic philosophy for contemporary life are profound and far-reaching. At the individual level, it suggests approaches to personal development that emphasize critical thinking, ethical reflection, and the cultivation of wisdom rather than just the accumulation of skills and information. It provides guidance for forming relationships that enhance rather than diminish human potential. It offers frameworks for making decisions that reflect genuine understanding rather than impulse or social pressure. At the social level, Platonic insights suggest reforms in education that would develop citizens capable of participating constructively in democratic governance. They point toward changes in media and technology that would promote understanding rather than just engagement. They indicate approaches to economic and political organization that would prioritize human flourishing over narrow measures of success, like GDP growth or electoral victory. At the global level, Plato's philosophy provides resources for thinking about how different societies and cultures might cooperate in addressing shared challenges while respecting their distinctive traditions and values. His recognition that wisdom and virtue can be expressed in different forms suggests approaches to international relations that go beyond either cultural relativism or imperial uniformity. The ultimate message of Plato's philosophy is that human beings have a capacity to understand themselves and their world well enough to live wisely and create just societies. This understanding requires effort, courage, and commitment, but it provides rewards that transcend material success or immediate pleasure. In an age of rapid change and unprecedented challenges, we need this kind of transformative understanding more than ever. Plato isn't boring, he's essential. His insights into politics, education, psychology, and human nature provide tools for navigating complexities of contemporary life that no other thinker has matched. His methods for promoting critical thinking and ethical reflection are more relevant today than they were 2,400 years ago. His vision of human potential offers hope and guidance for creating a world that promotes genuine flourishing rather than mere survival or entertainment. The question isn't whether Plato's ideas are outdated or irrelevant. It's whether we're wise enough to learn from them. In a world full of shadows on cave walls, we need philosophers who can help us distinguish between appearance and reality, between knowledge and mere opinion, between wisdom and clever manipulation. Plato showed us how to become those philosophers ourselves. The rest is up to us.